Okay, so I think it's 5 o'clock. So yeah, why don't we start? You can turn on your, or you can show the slides already. Let me briefly introduce the speaker. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our BK21 special lecture series today on global conflict now. And the topic today is poverty trends and measurement. Our speaker is Professor Joshua Merfeld. I think that could be German, actually.
Yes.
So I don't know if I should pronounce it German or American. So he's currently an assistant professor at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. If I hope I told that correctly. And his research interests are in development, poverty, agriculture, and he's, as far as I understand, has a regional focus on India and Africa. And yes, so welcome to Professor Merfeld, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Rudolph, for that introduction. Can you guys see my screen and hear me okay? Okay, great. As he said, I'm Josh Merfeld. I'm an assistant professor at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, and I'm also a research affiliate at IZA, which is the study of labor in Bonn, Germany. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about poverty. I'm going to first show you a little bit about kind of where we've come in the last couple decades. I've got a couple slides to show you just how we have made improvements in poverty. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the details and how we actually measure poverty, because we've all seen things like poverty statistics, right? The percentage of people that are poor, but there's a lot that go into coming up with those numbers that add a lot of context to how we should think about them, how we come up with poverty lines. Should we really be using headcount poverty? Just 40% of people are poor as our poverty measure, and things like that. And then if I have time, at the end, I'll tell you a little bit about a paper I'm working on related to measuring poverty. If I don't get to that, it's not a big deal. I'd rather leave time for discussion, so we'll see if we get there. Okay, so I'm going to show you a map, and this map is at the country level, and it's going to just break down countries based on a pretty well-known metric of gross national income. You've probably seen this before. It's going to break them down into 4 groups: low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income. Okay, and this is what it looks like. This is right from the World Bank's website. And when you look at the world by income like this, it becomes very obvious that poverty is pretty spatially concentrated. It's especially concentrated in Africa. So if you look across right the middle of the continent of Africa, that's where you see all those dark blue countries. And those are the poorest countries on average, right? South Asia and Southeast Asia also has some poverty, but as you can see, it's not quite as bad as it is in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, something that I just find interesting, and that's why this is in here, is that when we categorize countries like this, you can have countries moving from one group to another, even though the real situation on the ground hasn't really changed, right? So let's take a look at Indonesia, which is the second row there. So Indonesia from 2019 to 2020 went from lower middle income to upper middle income, right? So it sounds like a big accomplishment. But when you look at actually what happened to their average income, the gross national income per capita went up just $200, right? And when you think about how much measurement error goes into these statistics, right, calculating them is very hard. You can imagine that $200 could be nothing but you got lucky with the way you measured something, right? So we have some of this movement going on, and it isn't necessarily, real large changes in any of these things, right? And so that's why we're going to break down things a bit more later in the talk. Countries can go down too. So here's 3 examples from 2019 to 2020. Sudan is an especially interesting country for this discussion, their income seemingly went down by about 2/3 from 2019 to 2020. But a lot of that had to do with nothing but how they revised the results based on changes in exchange rates. So it didn't really actually represent any large changes per se. It really was driven more by just how they measured it, right? And this is really common, this kind of thing. So let me put this map back up. And what I'd like you to do is just take a look at this for just a couple seconds and see if you can come up with what percent of people you think live in each group, right? So like what percent of people, just using this map, would be in low income? What percent would be in lower middle income, things like that, all right? So here's what it looks like for the last almost 30 years, not quite, right? So if we start on the far left, 1994, what you see is that if you add the two kind of red, orangish groups together, you get a little bit more than 20% of the total population in 1994 lived in an upper middle income or high income country. You know, flip that around, that means almost 80% of people lived in a low income or lower middle income country in 1994. Now, if we go all the way to the right side, 2018, you can see that we have made substantial progress, at least at the country level, right? Now, fully half of people live in upper middle income or high income countries. And especially low income, you could see in 1994, almost 60% of people, it's down to about 10%, right? So we have made substantial strides in poverty, especially in extreme poverty, which I'll show you more of in just a second, in the last almost 30 years. Some interesting bits on this country is you can on this graph is that you can actually make out when countries changed their classification, right? So that's China right there. That's also China. There's only one other country that can make such a large move in this graph. Who do you think it is? From low income to lower middle? Oh, sorry. Thought I wrote it on there. That's India. Moving from low income to lower middle income, right? Okay, but this is at the country level. And I'm American. And in the US, there's a lot of inequality, right? So we have a relatively high average income, but that really is missing a lot of what's going on within the country if you're trying to measure poverty, right? So it looks like the US isn't poor, but we still have quite a few people living in poverty, although not by international standards, which I'll talk more about later. So instead of classifying individual countries, let's try to classify individuals instead, all right? So we can classify people based on whether they're poor, based on whether their income is just above some threshold. So you may remember, if you're a little bit older like I am, $1 a day, about a little more than about 20 years ago, was considered extreme poverty, right? It was this kind of attractive $1 a day. People living below $1 a day are in extreme poverty. So that's now gone up, of course, it's now $1.90. So, right, so we can construct an estimate for what percent of all people are living below $1.90 a day. We can also do it for like $3 a day, $5 a day. You can do it for anything, right? So here it is. If you're interested in any of this data, the data comes from PovCalNet. They have a bunch of really interesting poverty data. I made this graph myself in Stata, but the data is there for you. And so the way to read this is that, so for example, the $1.90, right? This kind of darkish bit on the bottom shows you the percentage of people across 4 decades living on less than $1.90 per day, right? And so when we break it down this way, about 40% of individuals were extremely poor in 1981. That's down to about 10%. So a 75% decrease in extreme poverty in 40 years. Pretty good, right? Pretty good. Now, as you go up, you can see that for these higher poverty lines, the improvement hasn't been quite as stark, right? So if you just go all the way up to $10 a day, you can see that there is some change, right? So about, what is that? About 75% in 1981. It's down to about 65% in 2019, right? So it's gone down. If you broke down all of that change, you'd probably find that a lot of it comes from China, where quite a few people have moved out of that. But nonetheless, you'll see that like for extreme poverty, we've actually done a pretty good job in the last few decades. For slightly higher levels of poverty, not quite as much, right? It's much harder to drive down. So all of those graphs use a measure of poverty that you've all seen before and that's somewhat intuitive, and it's called head count poverty, right? It's just the percentage of people who are poor by whatever our definition of poor is, right? So head count poverty, 40% of people are below the poverty line, right? So I'd like to talk about two parts of that. The first is how we're actually measuring poverty, right? So it was monetary poverty, right? Some amount of money in some line. And then I want to talk about how we actually define the poverty line, right? Like, why is $1.90 extreme poverty? What does that represent? Why does any country define poverty the way they do, right? In Korea, they have a poverty line. I should probably know it off the top of my head, but I don't. How do they come up with that, right? And then I'm going to talk about whether head count is really the best measure. It's very intuitive, and that's why you see it all the time. Everybody understands 40% of people are poor, right? But for a lot of things we're interested in, I'm going to argue it might not be the best measure. So I am an economist, right? That means I often think about welfare in a kind of economic sense. I say economists often equate welfare with utility. That's not quite true. We don't really equate them per se, but we do kind of think about them in those terms. So if any of you have ever taken an intro micro class and you think back to utility functions, I know you probably don't want to think about them, but if you think about them in kind of like Econ 101 intro to micro, one of the main drivers of utility is consumption, right? We want to consume things. You can define consumption in all sorts of different ways, but you know, we think higher consumption leads to higher welfare, right? And at least partly for that reason, one of the most common, the most common measure of poverty and welfare among economists is consumption or income. It's monetary poverty, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say that I don't think there's actually any right way to do this. There's no single right way to measure poverty. There are all sorts of problems, for example, with using monetary income, monetary measures of poverty, right? One thing is that there's a lot of heterogeneity, even within a country, right? You can have one poverty line, but different people have very different spending patterns and very different needs. So to give you an example, again, using the US, our healthcare system, if you have insurance, is quite good. If you don't have insurance, it's not great. I have diabetes. I have to give myself insulin every day. It's not cheap. So if I lived in the US, presumably we would want to think about whether I'm poor by whether I can afford my insulin, right? But that's not going to be captured in this poverty line for obvious reasons, because it's very difficult to actually do that for every individual, right? So there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity that we miss when we set just a single line. So the question instead becomes, you know, not is this way to do it perfect, but instead, is this way to do it helpful in some way, right? You may have heard the phrase that all economic models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So it's the same idea here, right? I'm not going to say this is absolutely correct, but the question is it useful? Before I talk more about monetary poverty, because that's what I am going to focus on, I do want to talk about a couple of other ways that people have thought about poverty, just so that you've seen them and you've thought about them a little bit. The first is what's called deprivations, right? And it's a little bit more holistic. It doesn't take a single number, right, and try to say, is it above or below some number? So deprivations thinks about all of the things that people might be lacking, right? Housing, sanitation, food, things like that, right? And then what we're thinking about is, instead of breaking this down into a single metric, is kind of checking boxes and thinking about where people might not have what we think they should have, right? This is somewhat subjective. Whenever you're sticking elements on a list, it's going to be subjective what should be there and what shouldn't be there. And there's also kind of this idea that it assumes what, we know what is best for people. We think we know what you should have, right? Which a lot of people don't like, for obvious reasons, both morally and historically. But that's going to be true with poverty lines too, right? Like the poverty line we choose is also going to be subjective, and it's also going to be based somewhat on, what we think someone should have. Probably the most common alternative way to think about poverty is thanks to Amartya Sen, and his thing was what's called capabilities. So capabilities is more about thinking about people's ability to function, right? However they define function. And poverty is about the lack of that capability, right? It's about the lack of the capability to function how you would like to function in your life, right? And the thing that I kind of like about the capabilities approach is that when we break down poverty into just this number, like dollars, one thing it doesn't tell us is why people are poor. One of the nice things about thinking about deprivation or thinking about capabilities is that you can start to break down these different areas and thinking about, well, okay, this person's clearly poor. What are those exact areas where they're lacking, and what can we do to focus on those areas, right? And Martin Ravalian, who was an economist at the World Bank and now is a professor at Georgetown, was one of the people who helped come up with that $1 a day poverty line several decades ago. World expert on poverty. And his words here at the bottom, arguably the most important contribution of the capabilities approach was the explicit recognition it gave to the fact that households vary in their capacity to convert commodities into well-being, right? Sorry, it's very warm in my office. Okay, so a simple money-based poverty measure doesn't capture why someone is poor, right? And that's what I was just saying. It doesn't capture why someone is poor, right? So people in poverty, it's not just that they don't have enough. It's also that they're not able to properly turn what they have into more, right? And on top of that, one of the things about thinking about money, going back to this idea that we don't know why someone's poor, is that there's a lot of people who view inequality of opportunity very, very differently from inequality of outcomes, right? So some people might be in poverty from circumstances that stem from completely beyond their control, right? Others, on the other hand, some might say that it's based somewhat on their own decisions, right? And so one way of thinking about capabilities is you might be able to get at this a little bit better than you can with just a pure money measure. Take this off. All right, can you all still hear me if I use this mic instead? Okay, great. So another thing that we lose when we talk about just income and consumption are social needs, right? Humans are social beings. We don't just live on money by ourselves in our house with nothing else, right? We also care about how we interact in society. We value social interaction.
We value our place in society, right? And so money misses that a bit. And this brings up an interesting discussion that I'll talk a little bit more about later on absolute versus relative poverty, right? So absolute poverty is what most of us usually, well, I shouldn't say most of us. Not everyone thinks of poverty as absolute poverty. But when we think about things like a poverty line, that's usually absolute poverty, right? It's just some number. Either you're below it and you're poor, or you're above it and you're not poor. But it doesn't matter how much money your neighbors have, right? It doesn't matter if your neighbor's poor or not when we're trying to measure your poverty. Relative poverty, on the other hand, is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's not just an absolute measure. It's that we also care not just about our absolute level of well-being, but also about our level relative to our neighbors, right? I think we can probably all agree that in some sense, both absolute and relative matter. There's probably some, absolute level of welfare below which we would all agree anyone is poor. But we probably also agree that it also somewhat matters about the context we're in, what our neighbors look like, things like that, right? Now, you can actually have relative poverty measures, even if it's not explicit. What I mean by that is, if you look at poverty lines in different countries, what you'll see is that the poverty line in really poor countries is much, much, much lower than it is in rich countries. And these differences are not driven completely by differences in prices. It's not just that rich countries have more expensive things. There's also a systematic difference in what we view as poverty, okay? So as countries become richer, it seems that the standards we use for poverty change. And we see poverty slightly differently. That what we think is an acceptable level of income changes as we grow, as our countries develop. So having spoken a little bit about that, I want to get back to the main point of this talk, which is monetary poverty, income and consumption, all right? So poverty headcount measures are pretty much always based on this. And poverty headcount is by far the most common poverty measures you usually see, right? How many of you have seen or know of the Sustainable Development Goals? I'm sure most of you have, right? Or at least know of them. The very first SDG is the eradication of extreme poverty everywhere. It's the very first one, right? And extreme poverty is based on monetary poverty line. The Millennium Development Goals, which is what the SDGs basically replaced, had a very similar goal, right? And it was based on monetary poverty. So for better or for worse, that's what we're going to focus on today because it, plays such an important role in a lot of policies today. I will add, by the way, that the Sustainable Development Goals, if you look at all of them, it very clearly targets more than just extreme poverty based on money, right? It's much more holistic than that. But the very first goal is still eradication of extreme poverty. Okay. So how do we actually measure poverty, right? And the short answer is that in most countries, it's household surveys. So like, for example, right now, I'm working on a poverty assessment for the Gambia with the World Bank. And we're using like 5 or 6 different household surveys from the last 5 or 6 years, right? And the nice thing about these surveys is if you do it correctly, we can use our small survey of just a couple thousand households to say things about the entire population. We can also say things about the percentage of people that live below different levels of income or consumption, right? So household surveys are by far the most common way that we are actually measuring poverty. So from household surveys, there's two different ways that we could measure poverty. And they both have their drawbacks and advantages, and their income and consumption. All right. It turns out that the choice is really important. And if I have time, I'll show you some results about this. This is the paper I was talking about at the beginning. But which one you can use depends a lot on the context. All right. When we think about how we should measure income and expenditures, one of the very first problems we run into is that the poorest households in developing countries often don't buy everything on the market. So all of us, for the most part, the things we consume, we go and explicitly pay for. You might go home and put them together, right? You might go home and cook yourself a meal with different ingredients, but you still went and you explicitly spent money on those ingredients. What that means is that it's somewhat easier for us to track what your expenditures are, right? Because we can easily break down how much you spent. But think about a farmer, right? So a farmer grows maize, for example. Now, they might sell some of that maize. They might also buy some maize, but they also consume it, right? And if I want to measure poverty correctly, I need to make sure I take into account the part that they consumed in my measure of income and consumption. But I didn't exchange money for it. So how do I value it, right? This is also true for income, right? Not just consumption, also income. If I'm a farmer and I grow maize and I eat it, the value of that maize should be in my income calculation. So the most common way to do this is to use local market prices, right? So you can use as part of your survey, you can have an enumerator go to the market and look up how much things cost. But not to just say all these buts and here's this is hard. The problem is that different households face different prices, right? The most common example that we might see here, well, two actually. One are bulk discounts. So if you go to Costco, right, you can buy a ridiculous amount of mayonnaise for cheap. Whereas if you went to Emart, per gram, it might cost you 20% more, right? You actually get similar things in developing countries too. It's not as stark as going to Costco, but bulk discounts can still be a thing. Another big difference in prices is that, so farm gate prices, that's kind of what the price of a good is when a farmer sells it at their home. And market prices can be very different. There are things like transportation costs. It's simply the amount I can sell something for is different than how much it would cost me to buy it, right? So it gets really, really difficult. You can start to see why people spend their whole life, like Martin Rebellion, thinking about how we should measure these things. In general, prices are not the same for everyone. This is especially true when you think about comparing across regions, urban versus rural. In a lot of developing countries, there's a lack of market integration. And what that means is that you can have very, very different prices for the same good, right? One of the things that levels out prices somewhat in a country like Korea is if maize is really, really expensive in one area, people in other areas will take their maize there to sell it because they can make more money, right? Arbitrage. But if markets aren't integrated, you can't do that. But even in a country like Korea, there are still large price disparities, right? If you think about the cost of a kimbap in central Seoul, it's quite a bit higher than if you go to rural Chungnam and buy a kimbap. It's substantially more expensive. And that's even in a developed country like Korea, right? Another problem with trying to value things is variation in quality. We should want the price to accurately reflect the item. And that means taking into account its quality. Quality of food can be really, really difficult to value correctly, like rice, right? Housing as well. In a lot of rural areas of developing countries, talking about housing costs or rent doesn't really make sense. That's usually not something that's explicitly paid in a lot of areas. Whereas in an urban area, it might be. And in fact, oftentimes these differences in prices within countries are sometimes not even adjusted for, right? They often are through differences in things like you can have an urban and a rural poverty line. So India has an urban poverty line and a rural poverty line. They also have different poverty lines for different states, right? So they do try to do this, but a lot of times it's either imperfect or in some circumstances it might just be completely ignored, right? And there's this whole different discussion about we want to measure poverty across countries in a way that lets us actually compare across countries, right? We want to say in some way that poverty in Kenya is comparable in the way we measure it to poverty in India, right? But that's really hard to do when prices differ. Not just prices differ, quality differs, preferences differ. In one country, they may consume something that is just simply not really consumed at all in another country, right? Like here in Korea, there's all sorts of foods that are really easy for me to find at Emart that I would never be able to find in the US, right? And vice versa. We consume very different things. So how can I find a way to translate these prices in a way that's comparable across different areas? It's actually super complicated, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it because I would really like to talk about the other stuff. But you've probably heard of purchasing power parity adjustments. And the basic idea is that I'm going to take items that are common to a bunch of countries, and I'm going to try to use those items to compare prices, right? It's not that straightforward. It's actually really complicated. There's this blog. If you search, how does ICP measure price levels across the world? You'll find this blog on the World Bank that talks about it. It's really complicated, way more complicated than I could possibly explain, even in an hour lecture devoted to that alone. Right? But the basic idea, like I said, is trying to compare the price of common goods across different countries to figure out proper exchange rates for this. It's a similar idea to within countries as well. Okay. So let's talk about the actual poverty line. How do we actually estimate the poverty line itself? Let's just focus on absolute monetary poverty. Just some line, we say if you're below it, you're poor. If you're above it, you're not. That's it. How do we actually figure out what the line should be, right? In other words, like, how do we decide on a reasonable approximation of what we would consider poor? And the very first thing to remember is that a poverty line is not a survival line, right? You can survive below the poverty line. If you couldn't, nobody would be poor, right? It's not a survival line. So there's two common ways used to estimate poverty lines. Right? So the bundle is somewhat subjective. We also get back to the issue of adjusting for prices. That's going to be true no matter how we do this, though, right? How do you put a price on something that might not even exist, right? So if you live in a developing a rural area and you need to see a doctor and there's no doctor near you, how do you put the price? How do you put a price on you visiting a doctor, right? It's difficult. But the basic idea, like I said, is you come up with this basket of goods and services, figure out how much it costs to purchase those, and then use that as the poverty line. The second way, which I like a lot more for reasons I'll explain in just a minute, is what's called the food energy intake method. The way this is done is you think about a minimum caloric intake, right? We've all seen, like, on the nutrition values on food packaging, right? It might say something like the percent of your daily value of calories, right? And that's based on some number that scientists have decided is a reasonable minimum caloric intake, right? And so what you can do is, like, let's say we can agree on 2,500 calories. It need not be that, but let's just say 2,500 calories. So what we do is we go to households, we do this survey, we have them do something like a food diary. So we follow very closely for like a week how much they're consuming, and we can turn that into calories, okay? And so for different households, we have different estimates of how many calories they're intaking. And then what we can do is basically, so let's say C star is the minimum caloric intake you need, okay? So what we might do is we might look at all of the households who consume approximately that amount, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less. So some group of households right around that minimum caloric intake requirement. And we find the average income or average expenditure for those households. And that average income becomes the poverty line. One of the nice things about doing it this way, and why I like it, is that it uses the actual behavior of the households, right? The previous method, we come up with a basket of goods and services that we think people should be, not should be, but are considered basic necessities. With this way, instead, we just say you need to meet this minimum. How you spend your money otherwise is totally up to you. And so what this does is it automatically includes allowances for non-food goods too, based on actual behavior. One big issue with this, though, is that calorie intake is, well, minimum calorie intake is highly dependent on activity levels. So I remember, I don't know if you all know the name Michael Phelps. He's an American swimmer, and he won a bunch of gold medals. Maybe like 2008-ish, I don't remember. He won a bunch. And I saw a show on his daily routine. And swimming, you burn a lot of calories. And he was doing so much swimming that he was literally consuming like 6,000 calories a day or something, right? Just an outlandish amount of food, right? So thinking about a more reasonable difference in calories, someone like a farmer who actually has to work on their land has a much higher necessary caloric intake than someone who might live in an urban area and work a desk job, right? So me sitting here right now isn't really doing much for my calorie needs, right? But someone who works manual labor might have much higher calorie needs. And so what ends up happening is if we think poorer households tend to need higher levels of calories, we're underestimating poverty in those households if we don't take that into account. So one quick slide, I said I'd come back to this, is relative poverty lines, because we're talking about absolute poverty lines, right? Notice in neither of these methods did it depend on what your neighbor looked like. It was like, we're coming up with this basic thing you have to meet, and that's it. Relative lines depend more on other people's income. The UK has a well-known relative poverty line. It's called strongly relative. And it's literally something like 60% of the median income is the poverty line. So if the median income changes, poverty changes, right? That's an extreme example. In practice, many lines are weakly relative. So I already mentioned this. As countries become richer, the poverty line increases, but it's not explicitly tied to some percentage of the median or the mean. Okay, so the last thing I think I'm going to have time to talk about here in the last 10 minutes is, so we have our poverty line. How do we measure poverty relative to that line? We all know poverty head count. I've already talked about it several times. It's just, are you above the line or are you below it? That's it. All right. It's the most common. It's the proportion of people who are poor. Why is it the most common? It's easy. It's intuitive. We all know exactly what 30% of people means, right? We have a good grasp on it. But is it necessarily a good measure? That depends on how you define good. But let's look at 5 different ways, or what Jonathan Mordock called axioms, of what a good poverty measure should look like. The first one is what's called scale invariance. This basically says that the size of the population doesn't matter. If the population as a whole doubles, but the proportion of people poor or not poor stays the same, the poverty measure shouldn't change. Basically, the size of the population in and of itself doesn't affect the measure. The second is what's called focus. Focus says that changes in income above the poverty line should not affect poverty. We want to focus on the people who are in poverty only. This explicitly, if you agree with this as an axiom, it explicitly rules out relative poverty lines, right? In the UK, 60% of the median income is one poverty line they use. Well, if income above the median goes up, the median might change, which means poverty could change. So the focus axiom, again, if you think this is something we want, rules out relative poverty lines. I think it's worth just pointing out one time that we're talking about poverty here, not inequality. Those are not the same thing, right? We're talking about poverty. The third axiom is what's called monotonicity. Monotonicity says that increasing the income of someone poor should always decrease the poverty measure. If someone is at $1 a day and their income goes up to $1.50, even though they're still extremely poor, a good poverty measure would decrease. The head count does not satisfy this axiom. If the poverty line is $2 and someone who has $1 goes up to $1.50, the head count poverty does not change. But I think we can probably agree that we want to be able to capture that, right? And so if you think that's true, we actually shouldn't use the poverty. We shouldn't use head count. The fourth is what's called the transfer axiom. So the transfer axiom simply says that if we transfer money from someone richer to someone poorer, the poverty measure should decrease, right? So here's an example. Let's say we're in some country where the poverty line is $1,000. If we take $10 away from someone earning $600 and give it to a neighbor earning $500, any poverty measure that satisfies transfer will go down. Basically, we're saying we want to weight poorer people more than less poor people. That's basically what it says. All right. The fifth is related to this. It's called transfer sensitivity. Transfer sensitivity says, okay, we take $10 from someone earning $600 and give it to a neighbor earning $500. If the transfer axiom is satisfied, poverty goes down. If we also take $10 from someone earning $300 and give to someone earning $200, the poverty measure should go down. Transfer sensitivity says the fall in poverty should be bigger in the second example. So it's not just that we want to put more weight on the poorer, but as we get poorer and poorer, we want to weight more and more. Right? So the headcount poverty, it satisfies only the first two axioms, none of the others. It doesn't satisfy monotonicity, transfer, or transfer sensitivity. There are other poverty measures. some of which do better, right? The first is what's called the poverty gap. There are different ways to measure it, but the most common is to take every single household in a country. If you're not poor, you're a 0. If you're poor, we take the difference between the poverty line and your income, and we divide it by the poverty line. So we say for each household, what proportion of the poverty line are you below it? And then we add it all together for all the households. We add them all together for all the households, and we divide by the total population. And the poverty gap then has this nice little interpretation of it's the proportion of the poverty line that we would need to transfer per person in the entire country to completely eliminate poverty, right? It's the proportion of the poverty line per person in the country that we would need to transfer to the poor to completely eliminate poverty, right? It does not, it satisfies the first 3. It does not satisfy the transfer axiom or transfer sensitivity. 2 common poverty measures that satisfy all 5 axioms are what's called the squared poverty gap and the Watts index. You might not have ever heard of either of these. And at least part of the reason for that is that neither one has an intuitive explanation. The reason we like the poverty head count so much is that it's so easy to understand. A poverty measure that has no intuitive explanation ends up not being a very attractive measure for a lot of policy stuff, right? It's very easy for someone to say, we decrease poverty by 10 percentage points when it comes to head count. With things like the squared poverty gap and the Watts index, even though mathematically satisfies all the axioms, we think they're great, they're rarely used for basically the reason that they don't have intuitive explanation. So let me very quickly, for 3 minutes, talk about one last thing, which is income versus consumption, right? I said we can measure income or we can measure consumption. And which one we should measure depends. And so this is the paper I'm working on with Jonathan Morduck. I'd like to show you a graph. So this is one household in rural India. This is one household. We have survey data. That's 60 months of surveys. So we see this household. This is the household ID up here. Household IAPA0053. We have their expenditures and their net income for 5 years, monthly. So we see them 60 times over these 5 years, okay? Here I have 4 of the years. Expenditures are in blue and net income is that kind of goldish color. You'll notice that income is much more variable than expenditures, right? Much more variable. This is at the monthly level. So for this household, monthly, their expenditures are relatively flat, but their net income is all over the place. And it's not just that. It's not just that household. Here's 12 completely random households from the data set. For every single one of these households, their net income is much more variable than their expenditures. Why does that matter when we measure poverty? As you can think about 2 different ways to do this. One, we could take a household's total income for the year, and we could just calculate a yearly poverty measure. Are you poor or not for the year? We could do the same thing with expenditures. Another way to do it is to instead say, let's look at your monthly poverty. Every month, are you poor or are you not poor? Now, With income, which is much more variable, so you got to think, remember, a lot of these households are, for example, agricultural households. Agricultural households spend a bunch of money at planting, right? They spend a bunch of money on inputs. Their net income often tends to be negative, even if they're a well-to-do household. Then, at harvest, they have a huge influx of income because they get this giant harvest, right? So for these households, their income is very seasonal. And what that means is if you measure their poverty with income at the beginning of the planting season, when they just spent a bunch of money on inputs, they look poor. On the other hand, if you measure their poverty with income at the end of harvest, they look rich. Consumption doesn't have quite as much variation. It's still variable. Seasonal poverty with expenditures is a thing, but it's less of a thing with consumption than with income. Excuse me. And the last thing I'll show you, and then I'll stop, because I think I have 50 minutes. Is that right, Robert? 50 minutes?
Yeah, we said 50 to 60. So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to show you two graphs, and then I will stop. This is how I think people often think of poverty. So across the x-axis to the bottom, what I've done is I have arranged households based on their total income. Total income over the entirety of the survey. The proportion of poor households is that line right there. And I think a lot of us actually think about it like either you're poor or you're not poor, right? Either you're a poor household or you're a not poor household. That's it. But it turns out, if instead of just thinking about it that way, are you poor or not poor? If we instead look at your money, your consumption or your income every single month, and we see what percentage or proportion of months are you poor, it doesn't look like this. It looks like this. So each dot is a household. The dots to the left of the blue line are households that are on average poor over the entirety of the survey. However, you see that these poor households are not always poor when we look at months. In fact, very few households are always poor. Very, very few. With income, 0 households, 0 out of thousands. 0 households are poor every single month with income. Right? 0. And you can see here how much we miss when we aggregate up and we just say, are you poor or not? It's much more complicated than that. It's not just about are you poor or not, right? Sometimes you're poor, sometimes you're not. And this is really one of the hallmarks of poverty in all countries, not just developing countries. It's not just that on average you're poor. It's not just that you don't have enough. It's also that you never know when you will have enough. It's not just lack of resources, it's also instability. Some months you have a good month, some months you don't. What makes that really hard is that you can't plan for things. It's really hard to plan when you don't know what your income will look like next month, right? If we look at the yearly level, blue households here are poor on average during the whole year. So just 12 months are you poor on average. But you can see only 30-some% of those households who are poor every month, right? Only 30-some% are poor every month. households are sometimes poor, sometimes not poor, right? And you can see that this instability is much more obvious in income. And that's because income is much more variable than consumption, right? I will stop right there. And happy to answer any questions.
Yes, so thank you very much, Josh, for a very interesting presentation. Maybe you can even leave your slides up there, because it might be that some people want to refer to some of those. Yeah, if I may start with one question myself, and the privilege of the moderator, I guess. I find this seasonal thing very interesting. I did a study myself looking at food security in Tanzania, and the problem I faced was we only had, I mean, it was panel data every 2 years, the same households were looked at, right? But the problem is the timing in their crop cycle. Yeah, when do you go to these villages? When are you taking the surveys? When are you really measuring how much they consumed in terms of food items during the past week, right? So it's so crucial, the timing, that my question to you, because you're working more on that, is how much can we trust poverty stats from countries when it depends so much on the time? I mean, if a government would just want to reduce their poverty figures, they just say, okay, statistical office, don't do the survey right before the harvest, do it right after the harvest, then our poverty figures go down by half.
Yeah. So the good news is, if you're designing a survey, when we think about representativeness of surveys, we often think about random sampling, right? So if you ever read about, average income in the US, it'll say something like a random sample of households. When we think about a random sample, we oftentimes think about it spatially random, like across the whole country. But for your example of Tanzania, where income and consumption are highly seasonal, as long as you also randomly sample across all 12 months, you'll still get an accurate average income or average consumption for the whole country for the whole year.
Which is, however, which out of practical reasons they often don't do, because they have certain survey teams. They send first in province 1, and when they are ready there, then they go to province 2 and so on. So it's not random. Yeah, so
the surveys that they often use for, so let me use the Gambia as an example, because I'm doing a poverty assessment there, is that the survey they use to come up with their poverty measures for the last time is not publicly available. So they actually have a budget survey where they do properly survey over time, right? Whether you have access to it is another question. So the LSMS surveys like 4 years. And so we can actually look at the dynamics of households going in and out of poverty. Whereas in your example for Tanzania, let's say you see a household twice, you see them every 2 years. But if they're interviewed at different times in those 2 years, you can't really say whether the changes you see in these households are due to differences in how the household itself, or just because you got them right before harvest 1 year and right after harvest the other, right? So it's kind of a long-winded answer, I think, to your question, but hopefully some help.
Yeah, so let's see if anybody else has a question. Please.
I actually had a question that's somewhat related to that. So I know that in general Psych 101 classes, they always tell you that you should be wary of random data sets, because how even getting it randomized, the people who are willing to answer the surveys will already have a bias. So I'm wondering, how are you accounting for like people that are part of minorities facing systemic challenges that might make them not available to fill in the data sets, or people with disabilities, or even people like the elderly or tribal people or homeless people who don't have access to maybe the same resources to fill out those surveys?
Yeah, so that's a good question. One of the big differences between household surveys in a country like the United States and a country like Tanzania is that refusal rates for household surveys in developing countries are actually really low. So it's like 90, like I don't remember the number, but it's literally something like 98 or 99% of households agree to be surveyed. You could imagine there's a bunch of phone surveys in the US where you're lucky if you get to like 10%, right? And so, if you have 10% of households agreeing, there's this really strong concern, like you just brought up, of, well, how are these 10%, different from the 90% who said no? Because if they're different, then anything that you get out of them doesn't necessarily apply to the other 90%, right? So the nice thing about having rates of 98, 99% in developing countries is that's at least a little less of a concern. It doesn't mean that it's completely absent, the concern, I mean. There is actually some evidence, for example, that the absolute richest households are underrepresented. So that 1% of households that says no, for example, could be huge landowners, in which case we are missing something systematically. The question about reaching other hard to reach populations is a really good one. I don't have good answers for those just because it's not something that I deal with much. Like let's just talk about like the homeless for a second. A lot of times, if you look at the methodology in a survey, it'll say something like, this survey is representative of this group, and homeless people will be explicitly excluded, right? So that, on the one hand, it's might be true that this is representative of the people that we say it's representative of, but it might not have some of those other populations that you're asking about. There are surveys that explicitly try to go after that stuff. I don't know a whole lot about them, so I don't know if I can really give a whole lot of additional information on that specifically. But your concern is a valid one.
Okay, any other questions?
I actually had another question. First of all, thank you for your answer. So when you're talking about expenditures, I'm just wondering, do health-related like medical bills count in those expenditures? Because I'm wondering if there's maybe like some cultural factors or resource factors preventing certain people from either discussing their health issues, reaching out for health issues, or being able to pay for those health issues, and then everything related to that. So is that included in that factor?
It is included as long as the households report it properly. Well, I shouldn't say properly, but as long as they report it. We do have health expenditures in the expenditure data, yes. Yes, we do have it, yes.
And actually, maybe to add on that, especially the World Bank's newer, well, the LSMS are already a bit older now already, but
they're great surveys.
Newer household surveys for developing countries actually include much more information than in the past. In the past, it was a lot focusing on income, expenditure, labor, so on. And nowadays you have much more information in order to also get some statistics on all the other SDGs, which we also want to measure, right? I mean, development is multidimensional phenomenon in the end. And so also this multidimensional thing is coming up these days in poverty statistics. Josh didn't talk about the multidimensional poverty measurement, which is kind of the new one, challenging a bit this income-based poverty measurement. And so basically there's a lot of information these days in these surveys, lots of questions based on health. How are your children doing? Did the child have diarrhea in the last 2 weeks? Does your child regularly attend school? And about maternal health, lots of things. And so basically there are many more aspects of how you can measure actually poverty in a non-monetary way in these surveys these days. And so, maybe my question to Josh. So you're focusing mainly in your research on the monetary poverty. Have you done something on the other part, the multidimensional ones?
Yeah, so let me preface this by just going back to the beginning and saying, I focused a bit on monetary poverty here, but I don't mean to give anyone the impression that I think monetary poverty is infallible or that we have to only use this. Poverty is multidimensional. And as with any really complex, complicated phenomenon, to really understand it, you can't just look at one number, right? So one of the things we're doing with the poverty assessment in the Gambia is we're looking at access to services. So this goes into part of that. We're looking at access to healthcare, access to like improved sanitation, right? Do you have access to a toilet? Not just that, like, do you just have access to a latrine away from the house? So we, there is in any actual poverty work that's trying to measure poverty, my impression nowadays is that it always has some of that. And this one that I'm working on now is no exception to that. So yes, we are. We're still doing monetary poverty as well. We're looking at education. Education's another one. That's going to be in one of the chapters. So I mean, the short answer to your question is yes. We are doing other, like we're looking at many things, even if we don't explicitly call this multidimensional poverty, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Good. Any other questions?
Don't be shy.
Actually, I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, would you go back to the slide of the map? We have a map, right, related to the income or something at the very beginning.
Yes.
Yes, this one. And I could see the 4 categories there. I'm just curious about the criteria about the category, because I'm actually from China. I don't know how could Chinese, we could have the middle high, like about the high average income. Actually, many friends, because we just many friends of mine, they just graduated for not a long time, and I do believe that we are, like, most of them, without the support of our parents, we're all struggling on the poverty line, something like that. So I'm just curious. Yeah.
So this right here is the cutoffs for 2020. So, China's a really interesting place when it comes to looking at poverty, because there's been I haven't done any research in China, so it could just be that my kind of my view of what's out there could be wrong because I just haven't done it. But like the way it seems to me is that China is really interesting because you have these just developed, rich cities like Beijing and Shanghai, and then you just have some western parts of the country that are as poor as you get. And so it has this really, and like you see this dichotomy in a lot of countries, like everywhere, the big cities are always richer than the rural areas. But like China to me seems really interesting because it's just so starkly different. So
Okay.
Yeah.
I got, yeah. Maybe just average number might be high. But
So,
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
exactly.
maybe to add to that, I just recently read that the majority that was about child well-being and the fact that China is now cracking down on private education and so on, right? In that sense, I was reading that actually, I think it was 70% or 80% of Chinese children live in provinces with an average GDP per capita of, it was 2,000 something, yeah? So below 3,000. So you can say, okay, actually 70 to 80% of Chinese population lives actually in a, what you would call a lower middle income status. Whereas the provinces, and it's not only Shanghai and Beijing, it's actually the whole, coastal provinces, the coastal regions, they have caught up already to European countries, to OECD countries in terms of their regional per capita GDP.
Yeah.
So they are already in the high income category.
Yeah. One thing that always amazes me about China is I'll read some article about a city I've never heard of. And somewhere in the article it says, this city of 13 million people. And I'm just like, how is it that there's a city of 13 million people I've never heard of before? This is amazing. Yeah.
Okay.
thank you.
Good. Any other question? Well, if there's no more questions, then I think we can conclude for today. So we can just leave it here. Thank you, Josh, for a very interesting presentation, and we had an interesting discussion afterwards. I hope your daughter is not getting tired now in the daycare. When does the daycare close?
When do they actually close? I think they close at 7, but I told them I'd pick her up by
7. Well, then
6:30.
I think you need to run to pick her up from the daycare.
It's literally a 4-minute walk. I'll make it.
Okay. So thanks again. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for joining, and yeah, see you next time at one of the BK21 lectures.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Josh.